Here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I am joined today with Little Gray Cells, and we are going to be discussing C.D.Jackson. And I think I'm going to actually have to turn off the. One second. I'm going to turn off the cameras for right now because my crappy laptop probably will just be cutting in and out. So not going to worry about that. Today we're going to be discussing C.D.Jackson. C.D.Jackson is one of those sketchy individuals, and we're just going to give a brief overview of some of the things that he's done before we get into the main part of it. So pretty much what you need to know is C.D.Jackson was a member of the media. He actually held a position at Time Inc. He was also heavily incorporated in the White House. He had a good relationship with Eisenhower, and he was also a member. He also was a member of the Psychological Warfare Department. This was actually commanded directly by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And his whole idea was that during the Cold War, he was a propagandist. He was supposed to be an anti-isolationist propagandist, but also an anti-communist propagandist. But he himself has a very interesting history, and one of the main topics we're going to be talking about tonight has to do with Operation Mockingbird. And pretty much what you need to know is that Operation Mockingbird was a CIA operation, and the idea was to pay off and own different members of the media for the CIA in order to gain control and control the narrative out there. So it was supposed to be, the whole idea at the beginning was supposed to be anti-communist. But I think in the modern era, in the age of fake news, we can see why this could be a concern these days, especially because the media has taken a far left-wing turn over the last little bit. So I'm joined today with Little Gray Cells. How you doing today, my friend?
Oh, smashing. How about yourself?
I can't complain. I never have anything too interesting going on in a day aside for school these days.
You have a nice chair.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I bought that a little while ago. I just I hadn't set it up since I moved into the house yet, so this is probably the first appearance of it over the last few weeks.
So you're liking your new place?
Yeah, it's pretty good so far. It's nice to actually be out of an apartment now. All right. So, and anybody who is interested, I'm sure a lot of people who are watching at the moment already know your channel. For anybody who doesn't, I've put a link to both his Twitter and his YouTube channel in the description. You can go check him out, and I highly recommend you do and hit that subscribe button because Little Gray Cells has a lot of really good content. So anyway, this idea that we have of I'm starting out with this Know Your Owners documentary. It's actually, the idea of Know Your Owners actually has to do, it comes from George Carlin himself, because George Carlin had this bit near the end before he died. I think it was within his last one or two comedy specials. He went on this rant where he talks about how the owners of this country don't want people to be well informed and realize how badly they're being screwed over by the people in charge. So the idea with this was that it was supposed to go a little bit past the idea of standard politics and and then get a little more into the actual idea of who's manipulating from behind the scenes, who's pulling the strings. Because you'll notice that a lot of names will end up coming up more than once. A lot of the same family names, a lot of the same people. They end up being involved, and this can also include both left wing and right wing politicians. Now, probably the most well known one is George Soros. Everyone pretty much knows who he is. They know about his Open Society Foundation, but George Soros is just the tip of the iceberg. He's sort of that person that they put out in front for everybody to know, but there's more people behind the scenes manipulating what's going on. So the last one that I ended up doing, it ended up getting blocked worldwide. That one was about the Bronfmans, and the Bronfman was a Canadian family, and they did a lot of manipulation of their own, and they still do to these days. In fact, a lot of people will probably recognize the name Bronfman from it was the NXIVM case, I believe, if that's the acronym I'm remembering, which has to do with that sex cult that has been that's been exposed over the last little bit because. Claire Bronfman was one of the people who ended up getting arrested, and then she was put out on a $100 million bail. So that was the first one I ended up doing. This one was about C.D.Jackson, and I will say that, Seamus, you've been one of the reasons I decided to choose C.D.Jackson, because you've talked about him in the past, and it's a little bit of a history lesson as we move our way up. So, I'm just going to quickly go through a quick timeline of C.D. Jackson, and then we'll get a little more into her. So in 1931, C.D. Jackson took a position at Time Inc., and he held that position for a long time. This is when he ended up getting recruited to Operation Mockingbird. And in 1940, he was the president of the Council for Democracy, and this was sort of his beginning when he got into the propaganda. By 1942 to 1943, he served as special assistant to the ambassador of Turkey, and from 43 to 45, he served with the OSS. And the OSS, if I'm remembering correctly, was the precursor to the CIA. And from 1944 to 1945, he was deputy chief of the Psychological Warfare Division, SHAEF, and SHAEF is an acronym for Supreme Headquarters Allied Expedition Force. And that one, as I stated just a little bit ago, was under the control of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who eventually went on to be the President of the United States. And then he eventually went on to be involved with the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services, as I stated, and the British Political Warfare Executives. From 1945 to 1949, he became manager director of Time Life International and became a publisher for Fortune magazine. And in 1948, this is when he got involved with Project Mockingbird. The Office of Political Coordination is created from the Office of Special Projects, and it was Frank Wisner who was the director at the time. And so the idea of psychological warfare is not to be so cliche to quote Alex Jones, but it is a warfare on your own mind. It's the idea that they are trying to manipulate the way you think. And in a lot of ways, I think this is what's ended up happening over the last little bit, because we've have a lot of people who they've lost the ability to think critically. They kind of just take what is put in front of them without much questioning. So I think that in what they were trying to do, the psychological warfare department was actually quite successful in that. And but this is also where things get a little bit interesting when we're talking about modern day news, because one person who actually, as we were talking about Operation Mockingbird, has to do with the CIA. Well, one person who's involved in the mainstream media these days who actually did do an internship for the CIA was Anderson Cooper from CNN. And, a lot of people have pointed to Cooper when they want to give an example of fake news. And I just think it's interesting that the CIA has put so much on controlling the media, because this isn't just CNN, or this isn't just Time Inc. or Fortune magazine. This goes back to a bunch of different. Different well-known media outlets. I mean, you could put the Washington Post in there. The New York Times was a big one. So you can see how this is actually being. How we're being manipulated every single day. And actually, I don't know if you know offhand, Seamus, but isn't anything the CIA does on American soil, isn't that technically illegal? Aren't they supposed to be
Yes.
dealing with, yeah, international affairs, eh?
Yes.
Okay. So already off the bat, we can see how this would have been highly classified, and most of the people who've been involved in the psychological warfare department have pretty much had a lot of their information scrubbed. So it's very hard to find this. Although if you go and know where to look, you can look it up. I actually was surprised because I found a number of my information both in the Eisenhower Library as well as I actually did find some information on the CIA website. A lot of it was, of course, buried, and you got to go digging through a bunch of crap, which is one of the reasons it took me so long in order to put this out. And but this is why I asked Seamus to be here with me, because he knows a lot about this sort of thing, about the people who operate from the shadows. So I thought, and he knows a lot about people, like he knows a lot about these sort of people. So I felt like he'd be a good addition to bringing, he'd be a good addition to come on onto the program with me. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we continue on?
I'm not sure. Sorry, where you're in your timeline. Are you in the 50s yet? Or
48 at the moment.
okay. Yep. All right. Sorry. I'll just. I think there was something, but anyway, continue. Continue.
All
Very
right.
good.
So and this is going to be, and this is a name that a lot of people are probably going to recognize, is that on August 16th, 1940, Nelson Rockefeller was named the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs and appointed by FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. I can never remember his middle name,
Delano.
and Delano. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and with responsibilities for disseminating the news, films, and radio in Latin America. Now, according to Deborah Davis, the author of Catherine the Great from 1979, they were saying that by the early 1950s, Frank Wisner, who was the director of the counterintelligence department of the CIA, had owned respected members of the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and other communication vehicles. So we can already see how some of the biggest media outlets all that at the time were already getting owned by the CIA with the intention of censoring them and of withholding certain information while putting others out there. This was, of course, it was sort of during this time it was starting to get into World War One, and it was it was just after World War Two, and it was getting into the Cold War. So propaganda was one of the big players between both the Soviets and the Americans. But the whole idea was that the press was supposed to have a good reputation. They were supposed to bring you the truth. But we can see, as going as far back as World War II, already the narrative is being suppressed, and they're controlling what you think of. This is a dangerous thing. This is a very dangerous thing to have, because the whole idea with the news is to bring you the truth. But already, like, this is not. So when Trump started talking about fake news back in 2015, this is something been going on for already decades at this point, and possibly even before that. I mean, this is as far back as I've been able to trace it, but it's quite possible that the news even before that was also being controlled, whether from the government, maybe not necessarily by the CIA, but maybe even the government itself. And so this whole idea, when it came to Operation Mockingbird, it was concentrated on propaganda, economic warfare, preventative direct action, including sabotage and anti-sabotage, demolition. So the whole idea was sort of to manipulate your ideas. And let's see. I do have some notes in front of me, because there is absolutely no frickin' way I could have ever remembered all this on my own. So, Operation Mockingbird, by 1948, Frank Wisner, from the CIA, he was appointed director of the Office of Office of Special Projects. Soon afterwards, he was renamed the Office of Policy Coordinator, and this became the espionage and counterintelligence branch of the CIA. And then, so probably after Wisner, the other one who was heavily involved with this whole situation was Philip Graham. Philip Graham was a publisher for the Washington Post and a graduate from Army Intelligence School. And so Graham was actually brought into this situation, and he was the one that did most of the recruiting of the people from the media. What I think is very interesting is that both Frank Wisner and Philip Graham allegedly, I'm going to put that in quotation marks, ended up committing suicide. For Wisner, it was in 1965, and in Graham, it was in 1963. And in both situations, I think it was a handgun, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm not 100% on that. But no, of course, this is something that we've seen before in the past, where people who have damaging information against the government, they tend to either disappear or they end up committing suicide. And actually, as I was kind of mentioning Seamus off air before we got started, I was actually making some reference to this, to the Chris Cornell and the Chester Bennington situation, which was the singer for these were the singers for Linkin Park and crap, I'm forgetting the other band. Oh well. Two big singers who ended up were allegedly going to lift the veil on some pedophile rings that were floating in the music industry, and then within months they both ended up dead. So you can look into it yourself and whether you believe it's and figure out whether you believe that Frank Wisner and Philip Graham actually committed suicide. But personally, with everything that I've come across so far, I didn't really believe it. Let's see. So going in, Graham ended up, his whole job was to recruit into this idea of Operation Mockingbird, and just some names that he ended up bringing into this was James Truitt, who was from Life and Time magazine, and also the vice president of Newsweek. Russell Wiggins, who had actually served as a naval officer during World War II, and he was involved with, he was a personal assistant to Philip Graham at the Washington Post. There's Philip Galen, who was also a U.S. Marine, and he was part of the Wall Street Journal, and also he was a deputy editor. He had a deputy hired as a deputy editor, page editor by the Washington Post. We have Alan Barth, who was involved with New York Times Magazine, and also several book reviews. We have the Alsop brothers, Stuart and Joseph, who were involved with the New York Herald Tribune, Saturday Evening Post, Newsweek. And we have James Reston, who is also involved with the New York Times and the Associated Press. And I think... And then just a few others that we had involved at the time was Ben Bradley from Newsweek, Walter Pincus, who was Washington Post, Walter Winchell, New York Daily Mirror, Drew Pearson, and who is involved with the Chicago Daily News, Hal Hendricks from Miami News, Whitelaw Reid, New York Herald Tribune, Larry O'Leary from the Washington Star. We have William Baggs from Miami News, Herb Gold, Miami News, Charles L. Bartlett from Chattanooga Times, and, of course, our friend C.D.Jackson from Time Magazine, who we're here to talk about. So already you can see how many of these organizations, how many news organizations were involved with this. And I think I already was mentioning that, I think I already gave the quote that it was by about the 1950, Frank Wisner had hired on dozens, if not hundreds of people who were involved with the media in order to try and manipulate what was going on. I mean, I kind of understand where they were coming from, Seamus. Like, I understand where they were thinking of as an intelligence agency. With the idea of spreading of communism, they were trying to keep that under wraps. But the idea that they were manipulating everyone right from the get-go and like putting out their propaganda is kind of a concerning idea, you know?
I have a slightly different opinion, but they're part of the game, and they know that. The communist system is something that they've manufactured, and so they get us all going off in these different directions. I mean, some other people, the Schultzberger family, very big into this. I know that's the head of the New York Times, the family that predominant shareholders. And I know Schultzberger said at any given time, this is, I think, in the I'm not exactly sure which Schultzberger it is. I can't remember, sorry, maybe Alfred Schultzberger. He said that any given time he has 10 reporters full-time on staff that are CIA agents. they've infiltrated all of the media and they show us with this fake news, and the fake news has been going on for a very long time, and it manipulates all of us into directions that I mean, if you look back to the testimony of was it Nariah? You guys remember Nariah?
I'm not
Nariah.
familiar with that one, actually.
Okay, so Nariah was somebody who gave false testimony before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. Basically, influenced America going into war, the first Iraq War, and she completely lied. And then you look through the relationships of who she is. But we have been conditioned to no longer think critically. So, you know, when she's standing there and she says, "Oh, I'm from Kuwait, and they were throwing babies out of the incubators and da 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 da," and nobody sat there and said, "Well, hold on a second here. You have no accent at all. You speak like a valley girl." Nobody looked to see who she was, the fact of who her father was, who was the U.S. ambassador from Kuwait. Nobody looked to see the relationship of who was the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, the head of that dual citizen, Tom Lantos, and heavily influenced all this. And then you can find the after the cameras kind of stop rolling. And here's Tom Lantos and the father, the Kuwaiti ambassador, Mariah's father, which then came out subsequently, but much later down the line, after, you know, this has already had its impact. Millions of people have died as a result just of this one lie. And this kind of stuff goes on all the time, and it's subtle. It's subtle when it gets into the news. I mean, we can look at stuff here in Canada. CBC, but the yellow cake, Egbert knows what this is. The CBC went from leftist to, when Trudeau got appointed, to very pro-communist. And they put those articles out, actually, you know, subtly saying to people, well, not even subtly, saying, you know, communism is great. You know, babies, like there'll be parents with hammer and sickle flags. And so, you know, I don't mean to digress, but the influence of our mind via the media was their old tool, Mockingbird, and they used it very well, and they still continue to use it, but they understand that has taken a back seat, but they've already planned for the next stage, which is the internet. And that's why people need to hopefully, and it's not an insult, because I equally was suffering from the same thing, and hopefully am not so much now, I still do, have to really relearn how to critically think and look at things from this emotional garbage that they keep throwing out all the time. That's one of the biggest weapons that they use, is to pull on your heartstrings and then go through with whatever mess that they want. Wars, which of course just lead to debt, and debt leads to more debt, slavery. Anyway, I'll stop.
Oh, that's too bad. I liked where you were going with that. But you are right, though, I mean, one thing that I've kind of noticed, especially in the US, and you will see it here as well in Canada, but I guess I first noticed in the U.S. when it was that the media was always seems to be banging the drums of war down there. Whenever anything happened, they were always in favor for it. And then after the fact is when they tried to roll things back. In a lot of ways, this is sort of what ended up happening with the second Iraq War, when they were, excuse me, with the second Iraq War, is a lot of them were talking about how the American military has to do something. They have to go in and they need to stop the weapons of mass destruction that were in Iraq. And then now, after everything's said and done, now they're talking about how it's such a big mistake and how they never should have gone in the first place. But a lot of the politicians down there, as when a lot of the media, they seem to have no problem that when it's being discussed about going to war, that they're willing to jump into it right away. It seems like a lot of it is just, and it seems to work a lot for the military-industrial complex. Is that they almost seem to be on the payroll of those people. And I
They
mean,
are on the payroll of those people.
well, when you figure this sort of thing out, and that the CIA has such a manipulation over them, then you can actually see why. And it's not just the CIA, because I when I was doing this, I came across an article too that was talking about how the FBI sometimes used agents as fake journalists in order to lure people out. In fact, this was actually something that. At the time, the director of the CIA, James Comey, I think it was back in 2009 or 10, if I'm remembering correctly, that they had actually used a fake article in order to lure somebody out that they were looking for, and then afterwards, James Comey had to come out to the press and pretty much and explain his actions and try and explain why he was justified in faking this. And then, like, again, when I sort of came across that I found out that Anderson Cooper had done some involvement with the CIA. That became very interesting to me, because this is also something I've seen where a number of people have. Well, let's just take Cooper's story. Cooper ended up doing a couple internships at the CIA, and then almost immediately jumps into journalism, despite the fact he had no real training. Or he had no real training in journalism to begin with, and as far as people can tell, he didn't really have an interest in it beforehand. But now suddenly he's almost, I would say, he's one of the faces of CNN. He's everywhere, and is one of those people that they push a lot in CNN for people to watch. So we kind of like, I guess, yeah, maybe I was. I think you're right when you say that they are actually on the payroll of the military-industrial complex. I was just toying with the idea. You at least full out came out to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of my opinions will not be mainstream ideas, and I know that you know what some of what I'm talking about. And I, at some point here, I just have to let it all out, because I mean, the truth simply is what I've learned, and I've spent the time. I mean, we can go back into, there was some tie that actually I was sending you about yesterday about Anderson Cooper and his, who's this? I think it's his great grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt was involved with equally with the, let's see here, I'll just plug through it. Equally involved with, here he is. Cornelius Vanderbilt worked for New York Herald and the New York Times. You know, they've been sowing ideas into all of our heads for a very long time, and the deep state that people refer to is the military-industrial complex, but then it's who owns the military-industrial complex. Why are they pushing the things that they're pushing, and putting just the different little pieces together? You know, the Iraq War, 9/11, the Second Iraq War, these things all those wars in the Middle East all have a very big purpose, and it was something that was written about much prior to all of that. PNAC wanted that, and that was a heavy lobbying organization involving, and I think if you watch No More News, which you were talking about, you know who PNAC is, right?
Yeah.
And PNAC's been pushing this garbage for years. And who is PNAC? And why do they want that? You know, it's the same stuff to do with the divisiveness that the media drives into all of our lives, making us all fight with one another. I mean, you look back at older videos where people were disagreeing, it's really funny to watch, because people will kind of yell at each other, and then maybe somebody will say an expletive, and they'll be like, "Oh, sorry about that." Now we have people who are beating the hell out of each other. wanting to murder each other. This is how much conditioning the media has on all of us. And if you throw in the biggest one of all, which is the internet, which is directly data mining on all of us, building specific profile inputs, having things like Tay AI bot was very well known. There is tons of this stuff out there. The fake things that are put out there to influence us all. And it subtly does. I mean, if your Facebook page gets tons of likes for something, it has a psychological effect. Facebook CEOs have come out and spoken about this, about how it is a psychological experiment that was started. The NSA, the day that they killed LifeLog, is the day that Facebook started. And LifeLog, of course, was its express purpose: to gather all of the data on everybody, everything for everyone all across the world, all your phone calls, your DVR, your GPS, your phone, everything, all the fucking click roll agreements that we all click. I accept, I accept, I accept. I mean, I was looking at OneNote this morning. OneNote. And OneNote is on Windows 10, which I'm just absolutely going to throw in the toilet. Because I can't deal with the amount of permissions and the fact that when I was speaking with them, I was like, I don't have full administrative on my own computer. And they're like, oh, what are you talking about? Here, we'll show you. I'm like, no, okay, I'll show you on screen share with them. Oh, well, yes, you're right. You can't do those kinds of things anymore. I'm like, what the fuck it's my computer. And OneNote is saying to me, oh, yes, by the way, you've given access to your webcam whenever we want. What does a data entry program have to do with my webcam? Nothing. But this is what they do. This is what they do. And you know, I'll kind of, I won't get too far into it yet, but we have to be aware of where this is all coming from. And yes, you are exactly right when they put out people, I mean, like Soros. Soros is not a secret. One needs to ask themselves, if you have tons of money and you're doing bad things, you think you kind of would keep it in the background. And that's where the real people lie, with the real power, the ones with the same names, generally, same families who have been doing it for generations, fucking us all. And the more you go through it, the more it gets really bothersome. I'm not meaning to be a doomsdayer, but absolutely to tell the truth. We have been fucked with royally. Our history, if you think about the fact that these same people control our history books, they control our politicians, they control, the political system is completely fake. Bernier proved that. And that's why I tweeted that out that day. The politicians are fake. They have an agenda that they have been pushing. Nobody cared about the transgender stuff. Nobody cared about any of this stuff. Everybody was fine, letting everybody live basically their own lives. But they being, let's even just go with the media. Fine, I won't be too tinfoily. The media makes us divisive. We read articles like Bushi and CBC just handily leaving out the fact that Mr. Bushi had a gun. And then they say, oh, write articles for Bushi's family and say what a miscarriage of justice it was. Well, of course, now what are you going to do? You're going to get the people who say, well, he had a gun. That seems rather unfair. And then you're going to get people who have been the native people, which legitimately have been fucked around for a long time. But they play on that. And they want you and I to fight with them. And them to fight with us. But it's completely fake. It's fomented by and large.
Actually, when you're talking about that too, about how they want to cause strife and conflict among people, there was actually one that came out from the CBC a while ago, and it was actually a tweet that kind of goes along with this sort of thing. It was when crap, I don't see a date on here. I just screen capped it, but it was CBC News, and they said it was a couple, like maybe about a month ago, when Trump ended up coming out talking about the land seizures of the white farmers in South Africa. It was a CBC tweet that says analysis. In a tweet, U.S. President Donald Trump criticizes non existent land seizures from white farmers in South Africa. South African government President Cyril Ramaphosa later tweeted that Trump's misinformation was divisive. But there's enough information out there to actually prove that that's actually the case, that there are actually land seizures going on, but they were trying to hide that fact. And you were talking about how CBC ended up going full communism once Trudeau came in. Another thing about that I noticed when the election went down was the fact that
He changed the CEO.
yes, you did mention that to me a while ago, and I missed that. I did not pick up on that at all. But one thing I did pick up was during the 2015 election, I think it was in the McLean's debate, Trudeau ends up stating, he criticizes Harper for making the cuts of the CBC. He says, I'm going to give them back all the money that was given, and then I'm going to give a little more. Well, after that, I noticed that the CBC they ended up putting out a lot of favorable articles towards Trudeau after that, and it seems like as soon as he said that, they had made their decision. And and I don't say this lightly because I've stated before on my podcast, so I don't mind stating it again. I have family members that work within the mainstream media, so I don't take this lightly. In fact, I was actually very resistant when the first time that the whole fake news narrative was going around. I was resistant to that until I started looking into it and started to see what everybody was talking about and how the misinformation is constantly out there. One thing I haven't actually looked into when in concerning to this to do with the project, the Operation Mockingbird, was that I wondered if our own intelligence agencies are doing something very similar, like CSIS or something like that, is doing something very similar with our own news, such as CTV or Global News. I mean, you yourself has actually one you've really gone into was National Post before Post Media, about how much they own of the English speaking news sources here in Canada.
Yep.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit just about your beef with them?
Well, they own three-quarters basically of every single city's newspapers, English speaking, save Toronto. But Toronto, they have the Sun, and so these papers that they own. Um, Case in point here, Calgary, they own the what was known as the kind of more leftist paper, the Calgary Herald, and they also own the right-wing paper, the Sun. And that I was speaking with somebody who was in the journalism business for a long time, and he's like, I didn't really mention anything too much, and then he kind of mentioned something. He's retired. He was in the business for 40 some years, and he said, I said to him, well, it's interesting. What are your thoughts about that? I just kind of noticed that. And he said, yeah, it all comes from the same satellite. We get all of our news from the same satellite. And I said to him, okay. I just kind of played dumb. And I said to him, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, look at your newspapers. And I said, okay, the same journalist will write the same article verbatim in multiple publications. They'll write it in the Sun, they'll write it in the Herald under the same name, and it has the same exact message. So it doesn't matter if you're a quote leftist or a quote right-wing, more right-leaning person, you're getting the same fucking message. And that chain is owned predominantly out of America by a hedge fund, and has a certain CEO who's in charge of it. And so we are all getting messages piped to us that are all the same. Somewhere I made a tweet of that one day about Miriam Monsef article just as an example. And the same article verbatim appeared in Globe and Mail, CTV News, CBC News, and one of the Post media papers. Those are supposedly 4 independent media organizations. Even now, it says that they're 4 independent media organizations. That Bell, that's Post Media, that's Globe and Mail. I forget who Globe and Mail is. Reuters, Thompson, and whatever the other one I mentioned there. Those are 4 supposedly independent media organizations, and yet they push the exact same message, word for word. Doesn't matter if you're watching it on TV, because that was the script that they were reading on CTV News. There's a problem with that. That's called indoctrination. There's no independence of thought. So if we all get filled with the same junk and don't have the time to go through and research things on our own, and we flip down to the United States. I mean, there's lots of people that put great videos of that stuff together. You know, the Christmas thing where they're just talking about Christmas shopping, and they'll have hundreds of news channels all across the United States, the newscasts, and the newscasters are laughing at the same thing, saying the exact same thing off the teleprompter about